He threw away the only woman who ever told him the truth. He believed the lie. He signed the papers. He walked out. And for 5 years, Adrian DeLuca, the most feared man in 3 states, told himself he had made the right call. Tonight, standing in the middle of a glittering ballroom surrounded by billionaires and politicians, he is about to find out exactly what that decision cost him. And the price is 2 little boys who have his eyes. If this story hits you somewhere deep, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The car smelled like leather and gun oil, which was the smell of Adrian DeLuca's entire adult life. He sat in the back of the black Escalade with his jacket unbuttoned and his tie loosened 2 inches, watching Midtown Manhattan slide past the tinted windows like a film reel he hadn't asked to watch. The streets were wet from an hour of rain that had stopped just before dark, and the neon from the storefront smeared across the pavement in long, broken streaks of red and gold. Salvatore, his driver, hadn't said a word in 40 minutes. That was one of the reasons Adrian kept him around. Sal understood that silence was not an absence of something. Silence was a preference. "Blackwood Grand," Sal said, pulling to the curb. Not a question. "Yeah." Adrian straightened his tie without looking at it. "Give me a minute." He didn't move. Through the windshield, he could see the front entrance of the Blackwood Grand Hotel, one of the oldest and most obscenely expensive addresses in New York City, a building that had hosted presidents and dictators and rock stars, and once, famously, a pope. Tonight, it was hosting the Meridian Children's Foundation Gala, an event that raised somewhere between $8 and $12 million annually, depending on how guilty the attendees felt about their tax brackets. The steps were lined with photographers. A string of black cars stretched half a block. Women in gowns that cost more than most people's cars moved through the lobby doors, while men in suits walked half a step behind them, performing the kind of comfortable wealth that took generations to perfect. Adrian had been performing it since he was 26. He was 38 now, and the performance had become so seamless that most days he forgot it was one. "You all right, Mr. DeLuca?" Sal asked. "Fine." He pushed open the door. The cold air hit him first, sharp, carrying the last of the day's rain. And then the noise, the cameras, the murmur of 100 conversations bleeding through the glass facade of the hotel. He straightened his jacket, and by the time his shoes touched the wet sidewalk, his face had settled into the expression that 12 years of running the DeLuca family had built into him. Still, composed, and absolutely impossible to read. 2 of his men fell into position on either side without a word. Marcus on the left, heavy-shouldered and silent. Dino on the right, younger, scanning. They knew to stay back at the door. The gala was not the kind of event where you brought visible security inside. You wore the security differently in rooms like that, in the way you carried yourself, in the way you shook hands, in the way every person in the room already knew your name before you spoke it. The lobby of the Blackwood Grand hit him with warmth and light and the smell of expensive flowers. White lilies and something darker underneath, a green note that he couldn't name. The floors were white marble veined with gold. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen explosions, each crystal catching and throwing light in 100 directions. Staff moved at that specific velocity that only the best-trained hotel staff ever achieved, fast enough to be efficient, slow enough not to suggest urgency. Adrian took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and did not drink it. He moved through the lobby toward the ballroom, nodding at 2 men whose names he knew and whose enterprises intersected with his in ways that never appeared on paper. Senator Horace Gelman, who represented New York's 4th District and owed the DeLuca family a favor that was now 3 years overdue. Thomas Breck, who ran a private equity firm whose real function was considerably less legal than its prospectus suggested. Both men acknowledged him with the precise degree of deference that indicated they understood the nature of that relationship without ever needing to articulate it. He handed the untouched champagne to a passing waiter and moved into the ballroom. The Blackwood Grand's main ballroom was the kind of space that made people forget their problems for about 45 seconds, which was precisely long enough to loosen their wallets. The ceiling was 30 feet high and gilded. Round tables draped in white linen filled the floor, each centered with arrangements of white orchids and lit by candlelight. A stage at the far end held a small orchestra playing something classical that Adrian couldn't name but recognized as expensive. The room held perhaps 300 people, and every single one of them was performing their version of the same thing he was performing. He stood just inside of the entrance and let the room settle around him. That was when he saw her. He almost didn't recognize her. That was the thing that hit him first. The fraction of a second where his brain registered a woman moving through the far end of the room and categorized her as noteworthy before it supplied her name. She was speaking to one of the hotel's senior staff, a clipboard held against her chest, dressed in something deep navy that was professional enough to be clearly working, but cut in a way that suggested she hadn't forgotten how to occupy a room. Her hair was up. Her posture was straight. She was pointing at something near the stage, and the staff member was nodding rapidly. And even from across a ballroom filled with some of the most powerful people in New York City, there was something in the particular quality of her attention, the focused, unhurried certainty with which she moved, that stopped Adrian DeLuca where he stood. Charlotte. The champagne glass he'd just accepted from another passing tray almost slipped from his hand. She hadn't seen him yet. She was still talking to the staff member, her head tilted slightly, listening to something the man said, and then she shook her head once. No, firmly. No. And the man nodded again and moved away toward the stage with purpose. She made a notation on her clipboard. Professional, controlled, completely at home in a room designed to intimidate. 5 years. He said it to himself like a number that still didn't make sense. 5 years since the night he handed her the divorce papers across the kitchen table of the house they'd bought together in Westchester. 5 years since he told her he knew the truth, that he had seen the photographs, read the report, heard what his people told him about what she'd done, and that he was finished. 5 years since she looked at him from across that table with an expression he had never been able to fully reconstruct in memory. Something that wasn't anger and wasn't grief, but was somehow worse than both, and said, "You're making the worst mistake of your life." 5 years since he told her he didn't think so. He had thought about being wrong many times in the years since. He had not let himself arrive at a conclusion. Looking at her now, across this ballroom, something sharp moved through his chest in a way that had nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with the simple physical reality of her presence in a room he had walked into expecting nothing more complicated than a fundraising obligation. She looked up. Their eyes met. Charlotte Ashford. She had gone back to her maiden name, which he knew because he had made himself know it. The way you keep a finger on a bruise to confirm it still hurts, went completely still for approximately 2 seconds. Then something moved across her face that she controlled before he could name it, and she looked back down at her clipboard. That was it. That was all she gave him. Adrian became aware that his jaw was tight. He moved toward the bar at the room's east wall, not toward her, and ordered a whiskey neat, and stood with his back to the room for a moment while he dealt with what was happening inside his chest. It wasn't guilt, exactly. He had learned to live adjacent to guilt the way you learn to live adjacent to a chronic injury. You compensate, you reroute, you develop workarounds so sophisticated that some days you almost forget the original damage. What he felt right now was something more immediate than guilt, something more like confrontation. She was here, in this room, doing her job, running this event with the kind of quiet authority that he recognized because he'd spent 12 years cultivating the same quality in himself. Charlotte Ashford had built something. He could see it in how the staff responded to her and how she moved through the space, not as a guest, not as an accessory, but as the person responsible for every detail that made the room work. He turned back around. Victoria Kensington appeared at his elbow like she had materialized from the ambient light of the chandeliers. Adrian. She said his name the way she said everything, with a warmth that was precisely calibrated to suggest intimacy without actually requiring it. She was dressed in red. She was always dressed in something designed to make you look at her first and think about her second. Dark hair swept back, jewelry that was significant without being ostentatious, a smile that had never once reached her eyes in the 11 years he had known her. "I didn't know you were attending." "I donate," he said. "I attend." "You usually send a check and a representative." "Change of plans." Victoria followed his gaze across the room with a smoothness that suggested she had already noted exactly where his attention had been directed and had been waiting to confirm it. Her expression didn't change. That was the thing about Victoria that he had learned too late to matter. Her expressions were decorative. They communicated what she chose them to communicate and nothing underneath. "Charlotte Ashford," Victoria said. Not a question, purely informational, the way you might identify a painting on a wall. She's running the event. She's been doing this for a few years now. Ashford Events. Very successful, apparently. She has quite a reputation in certain circles. A pause. She's very good at what she does. Something in the way Victoria said it, the particular placement of the compliment, the mild emphasis on what she does, registered as deliberate without Adrian being able to articulate why. He'd been reading rooms and people for a long time. He didn't always need to name what he noticed. "Excuse me," he said, and moved away from her. He spent the next 40 minutes fulfilling his obligations to the room. He spoke with Senator Gelman about a construction project in Lower Manhattan that required certain municipal approvals. He had a brief conversation with James Whitmore, who ran the Meridian Foundation, about the DeLuca family's continued commitment to the gala's endowment. He exchanged precisely the right number of words with precisely the right people in precisely the right order, and through all of it, he was tracking Charlotte's position in the room the way you track a detail that keeps returning to your peripheral vision. She was everywhere and nowhere. That was her job. To be invisible to the event itself while being essential to its function. She appeared at the edge of conversations to signal a change in program. She caught a waiter's eye from across the room, and the waiter immediately corrected a service error Adrian hadn't even noticed. She stood at the back of the stage while a foundation spokesperson gave the opening remarks, watching the room's response rather than the speaker, reading the temperature of 300 people simultaneously. He told himself he was not going to approach her. He crossed the room and stood beside her anyway. She sensed him before he spoke. He saw her shoulders change, a subtle tightening, and then she turned her head and looked at him with an expression so carefully neutral it was its own kind of statement. "Mr. DeLuca," she said. Professional, clean, not a syllable more than necessary. "Charlotte, if you need anything during the evening, please speak with my associate. Her name is Rachel. She's wearing a blue earpiece. She'll be—" "I don't need anything from Rachel." Charlotte looked back at the room. "Then enjoy the gala. You're doing an extraordinary job. Thank you." "Charlotte." "I'm working, Adrian." He stopped. The sound of his name in her mouth, flat and unhurried, made something tighten in his sternum. He had heard his name said with fear, with deference, with carefully managed respect, with the kind of deliberate casualness that people use when they're trying to project comfort they don't feel. He could not recall the last time someone said it like it meant nothing at all. "I know," he said. I didn't know you'd be here. I organize events. This is an event." She made another notation on her clipboard without looking at it. "If there's nothing I can help you with professionally, I need to move." She moved. He stood where she'd left him and watched her cross the room toward the stage entrance, and the feeling in his chest had resolved into something he could finally name. It was the specific physical sensation of understanding, for the first time in 5 years, the full weight of what he had done. Not guilt, not regret, understanding. Those were 3 different things, and only the last one hurt the way it should. He went back to the bar, ordered another whiskey, and this time he drank it. Victoria reappeared within 3 minutes, which told him she had been watching. She always had been watching. That was something else he had understood too late. "Old feelings," she said lightly, settling beside him. He looked at her. "What? They have a way of resurfacing." She smiled at her champagne. "It's completely natural." "Victoria." "I'm just observing." "Don't observe me." She turned to look at him with that practiced expression of mild, amused patience. "Adrian, that was 5 years ago. Whatever you're feeling right now, standing in this room, seeing her, it's nostalgia. It has nothing to do with the reality of what happened." He said nothing. "You made the right decision," she said. "Based on what you knew. Based on what I was told," he said, and heard the edge in his own voice, and stopped. Victoria's expression didn't shift. That was the tell, he realized, right there. When a person should react and doesn't, that's the tell. But he had already filed that observation in the same drawer where he kept all the things he had noticed too late. "I need to speak with Whitmore again," he said, and walked away from her for the second time that night. He didn't speak with Whitmore. He found a quieter corner near the room's west wall, behind a column that gave him sightlines without being immediately visible, and he stood there and watched Charlotte work for the better part of an hour. He watched her manage a crisis when the audio system briefly cut out during the live auction segment, He watched her redirect a server who had been hovering over the wrong table. He watched her appear at the elbow of the foundation's executive director at the precise moment a major donor required attending to, and then disappear before the conversation finished. She was good. She was genuinely, precisely good. He tried to remember what she had been like before, what she had wanted to do before everything collapsed. He remembered she had talked about event planning, about building something, about wanting to create things that worked. Not the language she used, but the feeling of it, the way she described wanting to walk into a room she'd built and know that every detail was right. He had listened to her talk about it the way people listen to things they love but don't fully understand, with appreciation rather than real attention. He understood, standing in this room she'd built, that he had not paid enough attention to most of what mattered. The gala wound down past 10 o'clock. The live auction concluded, the orchestra shifted to something softer, and the crowd began thinning in that gradual way that events in rooms like this always ended. Not a departure, but a slow dissolve, people peeling away in twos and threes, the energy dropping by degrees until what remained was the residue of an evening rather than the evening itself. Adrian had said what he needed to say to the people he needed to say it to. His obligation to the room was technically fulfilled. He should have left. He was watching Charlotte supervise the initial stages of breakdown, speaking quietly with her staff, directing the careful removal of floral arrangements, when he became aware of something shifting in the room's remaining social geometry. A small cluster of people near the stage exit had arranged themselves in the specific formation that meant someone was at the center of it, someone whose presence was generating a gravitational pull. It wasn't until the cluster shifted slightly that he saw what was at the center of it. 2 boys, 8 years old, maybe 9, dressed in small suits that looked like they'd been worn carefully and were slightly askew at the collar. One of them, the slightly taller one, was talking animatedly to a woman who appeared to be a nanny or caretaker, his hands moving as he described something. The other was quieter, standing with his hands clasped in front of him in a posture that was oddly adult, watching the room with a stillness that felt familiar in a way Adrian couldn't immediately locate. He watched Charlotte cross the room toward them. The animated boy immediately launched into a story, and Charlotte bent slightly to hear it, and the expression on her face when she looked at him was something Adrian had not seen in 5 years and had half forgotten existed. Unguarded, unperformed, entirely real. She laughed at something the boy said. The quiet one tugged at her sleeve, and she turned to him and touched his face briefly with one hand. Something moved through Adrian's chest again, different from before. He looked at the boys more carefully. The quiet one had turned slightly, and Adrian caught his profile, but the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, something in the particular line of his nose, and experienced a moment of pure, inexplicable disorientation, like looking at a photograph of himself that he had no memory of being taken. He told himself that was absurd. He told himself a lot of things in the next 10 minutes while he stood very still behind his column and watched Charlotte Ashford gather her sons, because they were clearly her sons, that was no longer in question, and begin moving them toward the lobby exit. She spoke to her staff once more, received a nod of confirmation, and then walked out of the ballroom with a boy on each side of her, her hand briefly touching each of their shoulders in turn. The quiet one looked back once, just before they passed through the doorway. He looked directly at Adrian, not at the room, not at the event. At Adrian specifically, with the unerring accuracy of a child who has not yet learned to pretend he isn't looking at something. Then he turned and followed his mother out the door. Adrian stood behind his column for a long moment after they had gone. His phone vibrated. Marcus, texting from the lobby. Ready when you are. He put the phone away without responding. He pulled out the card in his jacket pocket, his own card, which he had produced 3 times tonight in various business contexts, and turned it over. On the blank back, he wrote nothing. He put it away again. Marcus texted again. He thought about the shape of that boy's jaw, the particular set of those eyes, the stillness in that child's posture that had felt, for one destabilizing moment, like looking into a mirror that showed him something he had lost. He thought about Charlotte's face when she looked at her sons, the specific quality of a woman who has been solely responsible for something irreplaceable and has organized her entire self around protecting it. He thought about what Victoria had said, based on what you knew, the precision of that phrasing, not what was true, not what happened, what he knew. His phone vibrated a third time. Adrian DeLuca, the man that 3 federal task forces had been trying to build a case against for 11 years. The man who had put 6 rival family bosses in the ground and settled a war with the Carducci outfit without firing a single shot. The man who had not flinched in a negotiation or a confrontation or a crisis in over a decade, stood in the thinning residue of a charity gala and felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with any of those things. He walked to the lobby. He gave Marcus a nod and moved toward the exit. In the car, Sal pulled into traffic without being told where to go because he knew the route home. Adrian sat in the back with his jacket unbuttoned and watched the wet streets of Manhattan scroll past and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I need some information." Sal's eyes moved to the rearview mirror briefly. "What kind?" "Charlotte Ashford. I need to know everything about her life for the last 5 years." He paused. "Her company, her address, her routine." Another pause. "And anything about the boys?" Sal said nothing. "Everything," Adrian said. "I want it thorough." "I'll make some calls." Adrian looked out the window. A woman in a yellow coat was walking a dog along the wet sidewalk, and the dog stopped to investigate something in the gutter, and the woman waited with complete patience. It was a small thing, an inconsequential thing. He watched it until the car moved past. He was still seeing the shape of that boy's jaw. He was still hearing the particular flatness in Charlotte's voice when she said his name. Not bitterness, not pain. Flatness. The specific emotional register of someone who has processed a wound so completely that what remains is simply distance. You cannot manufacture that kind of distance. It takes years. It takes raising 2 children alone, he thought, and then stopped himself because he did not yet have the right to think in those terms. Not yet, but something in his gut. The same instrument that had kept him alive through 12 years of a business that killed most men before they saw 40, was already telling him that the fraction of a second disorientation he had felt, looking at that quiet boy's profile, was not nothing. It was not nostalgia. It was not the light. It was something that lived in the architecture of a face, something written in bone and geometry that no amount of years or distance could revise. He would get the information. He would look at what it told him, and then he would decide what kind of man he intended to be about it. The Escalade moved through the wet Manhattan streets, carrying him away from a ballroom where the woman he had discarded had built a life so self-sufficient and complete that she had looked at him across a room and felt nothing. And somewhere in the city behind him, 2 boys in slightly askew suit jackets were being put to bed by a woman who had learned, through 5 years of absolute necessity, how to be enough for both of them. Adrian DeLuca closed his eyes. He did not sleep. He was still awake when the car reached Westchester, and still awake an hour after that, sitting in the leather chair in his study with a glass of whiskey he didn't touch, and the file that Marcus had begun assembling hadn't arrived yet, but it would by morning. He was still awake when the first information came through, just preliminary, a business summary, a few addresses, and he read it without moving, and the last line of the summary was a detail so ordinary that it should have meant nothing. No father listed on record for either child. He put the paper down on his desk. He sat with that for a long time. Outside the window of his study, the night was clearing. The rain had moved east and the sky over Westchester was showing the first suggestion of its own lightening, the dark thinning at the horizon in that specific way that meant morning was coming whether you were ready for it or not. Adrian DeLuca had built his entire adult life on the principle that information was power, and that certainty was the only foundation worth standing on. He had made one catastrophic exception to that principle 5 years ago, across a kitchen table in this very house, and he had been living in the wreckage of that exception ever since, without admitting to himself that it was wreckage. He picked up the paper again. No father listed on record for either child. The boys were 8 years old. He and Charlotte had been separated for 5 years. The math was not complicated. The math was in fact devastatingly simple, and it sat in the center of his chest like something that had been there for a long time waiting to be discovered, like a structural fault you don't find until the building starts to move. He was still sitting in that chair, paper in hand, when his phone rang at 5:47 in the morning. It was his consigliere, Petrov, calling about a supply issue in the Philadelphia corridor that required his attention. He answered it. He spoke for 11 minutes about logistics that had nothing to do with anything he was actually thinking about. He hung up. He looked at the paper. He picked up his phone and sent Marcus a single message. I need more. Everything. Depth, not summary. Give me 2 days. Then he put the phone down and sat in his chair as the morning light came through the windows of a house he had bought with a woman he had thrown away, and waited for the world to tell him how wrong he had been. The file arrived at 7:12 in the morning, delivered by hand by a man named Cortez, who worked 3 layers below Marcus in the family's intelligence network, and whose specific value was that he left no digital footprint. Adrian was already at his desk when Cortez set the manila envelope down without a word and left the room. The envelope was thick. That was the first thing. It was the kind of thick that meant someone had been thorough. And thorough meant that whoever had assembled it had found things worth assembling. Adrian poured cold coffee from the carafe on his desk and did not drink it and opened the envelope. Cortez had included financials, a business registration history, lease agreements, 3 years of press mentions and trade publications, and a photograph taken from what appeared to be a public Instagram account belonging to someone named Rachel Tan, the associate Charlotte had mentioned at the gala. In the photograph, Charlotte stood in front of what the caption identified as the Ashford Event Studio on West 47th Street, squinting slightly against afternoon sun, one hand raised to shade her eyes. She was wearing jeans and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. She looked like a woman who had just finished moving furniture. She looked healthy. She looked like someone who had not spent 5 years waiting for anything. He set that photograph aside and read through the business summary. Ashford Events, LLC, incorporated 4 years and 3 months ago. Initially operating from a rented desk in a shared workspace in Midtown. First major contract secured 14 months after incorporation, a corporate summit for a pharmaceutical company. By the end of year 2, the company had expanded to a staff of 7 and relocated to the West 47th Street studio. Current staff, 14 full-time, additional contract workers engaged per event. Annual revenue for the most recent fiscal year, $1.2 million. Client list included 3 Fortune 500 companies, 2 major charitable foundations, and a roster of private clients whose events ranged from corporate retreats to what one trade publication described as the most meticulously executed private wedding in the Hamptons in recent memory. She had built it from nothing. From the ruins of what he had done to their life together, she had built something that now employed 14 people and generated over $1 million a year, and she had done it while raising 2 children. He turned to the section on the boys. Logan and Landon Ashford, age 8, enrolled at Keller Academy, a private school in the West Village. Logan, the elder by 4 minutes according to the birth record Cortez had obtained, the more social of the two, active in the school's drama program and youth soccer league. Landon, quieter by all accounts, described by a source Cortez had cultivated, a school administrator, unnamed, as exceptionally observant for his age, and something of an old soul. Both boys were described as well-adjusted, performing above grade level, well-liked by teachers and peers. The birth records listed Charlotte Ashford as mother. The space for father was blank on both documents, not unknown, not disputed. Blank. As though the question had been considered and answered with silence. Adrian set the file down on his desk and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed. The math had been simple last night. In the morning light, with the documents in front of him, it was not math anymore. It was architecture. It was the shape of 5 years of absence given weight and dimension and the specific, irreversible reality of 2 names on a page. His phone rang. He looked at the screen, Petrov again. He let it ring. He picked the file back up and turned to the final section. Cortez had included, almost as a footnote, a single paragraph flagged with a yellow tab. A note from the investigator about a secondary inquiry that had run parallel to the main research. Someone else had been gathering information on Charlotte Ashford. Not recently. Over an extended period dating back approximately 14 months. The inquiry had been conducted through a private security firm operating out of a shell company registered in Delaware, and the trail from that shell company led, after 2 layers of corporate structure, to a holding company whose principal beneficiary was Victoria Kensington. Adrian read that paragraph 3 times. Then he closed the file. He sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. The kind of stillness that people who knew him well recognized as the most dangerous version of him. Not the raised voice, not the visible anger, but this. The complete cessation of visible reaction, the total internal redirection of energy that preceded the very worst of his decisions. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "Victoria Kensington," he said when Marcus answered. "Pull everything we have on her current activities. Financial moves, communications, anything flagged in the last 18 months. A pause. "And find out who she's been paying at Delacroix Security." "Delacroix," Marcus repeated. "That's the firm that handles corporate intelligence." "I know what it handles. Find out what they've been doing for her." He hung up and stood and walked to the window of his study. The morning outside was cold and clear, the sky a hard blue that offered no warmth. The grounds of the Westchester property were wet from the previous night's rain, and the gardener was making slow progress along the east hedge, working with the methodical patience of someone who understood that some things could not be rushed. Adrian watched him for a moment. Then he went to find a shower and a clean suit, because he had a meeting in 3 hours in Lower Manhattan with a man named Ferretti, who represented the Basciano family's interests in the Port Authority contracts, and whatever was happening inside him right now had to be put somewhere it wouldn't interfere. That was the discipline of his life. That was the architecture of how he functioned. You built walls between compartments, and the walls held because you built them to hold. And the work got done because the work had to get done. He dressed, and the walls held, and he drove to Manhattan. The meeting with Ferretti lasted 90 minutes and accomplished what it needed to accomplish. Adrian shook hands across a table in the back room of a restaurant on Mulberry Street and agreed to terms that protected the DeLuca family's interests in 3 ongoing port contracts, while conceding a minor logistical point that Ferretti would interpret as a gesture of goodwill and that Adrian had always intended to concede. It was a clean outcome. Petrov, who was present, seemed satisfied. Adrian was back in his car by 1 in the afternoon. "West Village," he told Sal. Sal glanced at him in the mirror. "Specifically?" "Keller Academy. I just need to know where it is." He wasn't going to the school. He knew that. He was not a man who showed up unannounced at a child's school, like a figure from a nightmare. But he needed to know where it was, the way you need to know the location of something you are going to have to deal with eventually. Not today, but eventually, and sooner than you're ready for. Sal drove him past it, a 4-story limestone building on a quiet block, with iron fencing and a small plaza out front where a few parents were collecting children in the early afternoon. It looked exactly like what it was, a place where careful, attentive people sent their children to be educated by other careful, attentive people in an environment designed to produce exactly the kind of boys that Cortez's file had described. Well-adjusted, performing above grade level, well-liked. He looked at it through the tinted window for about 10 seconds as the car moved past. "Back to the office," he said. The call from Victoria came at 3:47. He almost didn't answer it. He looked at her name on the screen for 4 full rings while sitting behind his desk in the family's Midtown offices, and then he answered because not answering was itself a communication he wasn't ready to make yet. "Adrian." The warmth. Always the warmth first. "I wanted to check in. Last night seemed eventful." "Did it? You seemed distracted." A brief, well-crafted pause. "I hope I didn't say something that upset you." "What would you have said that might upset me, Victoria?" A beat of silence. "Just one." "I only meant that seeing Charlotte after all this time must have been complicated. For anyone, that would be complicated." "It was a professional encounter." "Of course." Another pause, this one slightly longer. "She looked well." "She did." "Those boys of hers are adorable." The sentence was delivered with such perfect casualness that it took him a moment to register it as deliberate. "I didn't know she'd brought them. Unusual, to bring children to an event you're running." He kept his voice completely level. "I didn't speak with them." "No, I didn't think you had." A small sound that might have been a laugh. "I just noticed them. Hard not to. They look so much like her." He said nothing. "Well," Victoria said, "I just wanted to make sure you were all right. You left early." "I had things to attend to." "Of course you did. You always do." The warmth again, dialed up slightly. Call me when you have an evening free. We haven't had dinner in weeks. I'll check my schedule. He ended the call and set the phone on his desk. They looked so much like her. He had noted what she said and what she hadn't said with equal attention, and both were informative. Victoria Kensington was not a woman who said careless things. Every word she produced was a choice, which meant that the emphasis she had placed on the boy's resemblance to Charlotte, rather than any resemblance to anyone else, was a choice. A small, careful choice, made by a woman who had been paying a private intelligence firm to investigate Charlotte Ashford for over a year, and who clearly knew something she was choosing to frame very carefully. He picked his phone back up and sent Marcus a second message. Priority. Everything on Delacroix. Today. Then he made himself focus on the 6 other things that required his attention that afternoon, and he did the work, and the walls held. For 3 more days. On the 4th day after the gala, he went to find her. He knew from Cortez's file that Charlotte typically arrived at the West 47th Street studio between 8 and 8:30, that she worked through most of the day, and that on Tuesdays and Thursdays she left by 4 to collect the boys from school herself, rather than sending the caretaker. It was Thursday. He was waiting outside the school on West 10th Street at 3:45. He was not hiding. He was standing at the iron fencing of the small plaza with his hands in his coat pockets, visible, in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. And when Charlotte came around the corner at 3:58, she saw him immediately. She stopped walking for precisely 1 step, 1 complete cessation of forward motion. And then she continued at exactly the same pace and stopped 5 feet in front of him. She was wearing a long camel coat, a bag on one shoulder, hair down today. She looked at him the way you look at something you were hoping not to deal with and are now going to have to deal with. "You're outside my son's school," she said. "I needed to speak with you." "You needed to speak with me at my son's school." "Charlotte, don't." The word was quiet and absolute. "Whatever you're about to say, don't say it here." "I'm not going to say anything here. I'm asking you to meet with me, somewhere you choose, somewhere you're comfortable. I'm not asking for anything except 20 minutes. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, other parents were arriving, the small plaza filling with the particular noise of school pickup. Children's voices, the shuffle of backpacks, the half-attention of adults on phones. Charlotte's attention did not waver. "Why?" she said. "Because I have questions that I need answers to, and you're the only person who can give them to me." "I'm not responsible for answering your questions, Adrian. I know that. I don't owe you anything." "I know that too." Another long look. Whatever she was reading in his face, she read it thoroughly. Charlotte Ashford had always been precise in her assessments of people. It was one of the things that had made her extraordinary at her work, and one of the things that made her, in the context of their history, particularly devastating to stand in front of. "I'll meet you," she said finally. "Not today. Saturday morning. There's a coffee place on Jane Street called Birch. 9 o'clock. She paused. "If you're late, I leave." "I won't be late." She looked at him for one more moment. Not hostile, not warm, simply appraising, in the way of someone confirming a decision they've already made. And then she walked past him into the plaza, and within 30 seconds 2 boys in school uniforms had found her, and the quiet one, Landon, had slipped his hand into hers without being asked, and the louder one, Logan, was already talking. Adrian stood at the fence and did not stare. He walked back to where Sal was parked around the corner and got into the car. "Jane Street," Sal said after a moment. "Birch Coffee, Saturday, 9 a.m. Adrian looked at him. "The school plaza has a sight line to the car," Sal said without expression. "I wasn't trying to listen." "It's fine." Adrian looked out the window. "Saturday, 9. Marcus called with the Delacroix information on Friday morning. He came in person rather than sending it, which told Adrian before he heard a word that what Marcus had found was significant enough to deliver with a face attached to it. Marcus sat across from him at the desk in the Westchester study and put a folder down and said, "Delacroix ran a full background and surveillance operation on Charlotte Ashford, commissioned 14 months ago through a shell company that clears back to Victoria Kensington. The scope was personal, not professional. They pulled financials, daily movements, school records for the children." A pause. and they generated a report on the boy's parentage. Adrian did not move. They did DNA analysis? He asked. His voice was completely flat. Not directly. They built a circumstantial case. Timeline of your marriage, separation date, the boy's birth date, physical characteristics noted in surveillance photographs. Marcus opened the folder and slid a single page across the desk. The report concludes with high probability that the boys are yours. Adrian looked at the page. It was a summary document, 2 paragraphs, clinical and precise in the way of professional intelligence reporting. The language was careful, consistent with, suggests, probability assessment, but the conclusion was unambiguous. Whoever Delacroix had put on this had done their job competently, and the conclusion they had reached 14 months ago was the same conclusion Adrian had arrived at 4 days ago in this same room. Victoria commissioned this 14 months ago, he said. Yes, and she's had this information for 14 months. That's correct. He looked up from the page and said nothing. Marcus said nothing. That was answer enough. Adrian placed the page back on the folder and slid it back across the desk and sat very still with his hands flat on the surface in front of him. Victoria had known for over a year. She had been sitting with this knowledge and making strategic calculations about it, which meant that her appearance at the gala, her presence at his elbow within minutes of his arrival, her careful observation of where his attention went, her precise placement of compliments about Charlotte's boys, none of it had been coincidence or social instinct. It had been informed positioning. It had been a woman who held an advantage, choosing the moment to apply pressure. He thought about her voice on the phone. They looked so much like her. The omission of the obvious corollary. The specific frame she had placed on the observation. He thought about 5 years ago, and the photographs, and the report, and the voice of his own people telling him what they had found and what it meant. He thought about Charlotte's face across the kitchen table, the expression he had never been able to reconstruct, and the words she had said, "You're making the worst mistake of your life." She had known exactly what she was saying. She had known, and he had not listened. And the reason he had not listened was sitting somewhere in this city with 14 months of damaging information and a very patient strategy. "I want to know everything Victoria Kensington has done with this information," Adrian said. "Who she's spoken to about it, whether she's approached Charlotte, whether she shared the report with anyone. I want to know if she intends to use it and how." Understood. And Marcus, he waited until his man looked at him directly. "Nobody touches anything until I say so. Nobody moves. Nobody makes contact. Nobody sends a message. This is internal. This is mine." Marcus nodded and took the folder and left. Adrian sat in the chair for a while after the door closed. He had built his life on a very simple principle. Information, correctly understood, resolves most problems before they become crises. The problem was that understanding information correctly required that the information be accurate, and 5 years ago, the information he had been given had been neither accurate nor accidental. He had been shown a lie with enough supporting architecture to pass for truth, and he had chosen to believe it because, and this was the thing he had been avoiding for 5 years, the thing he could no longer avoid, because some part of him had wanted an exit. Some part of him had been afraid of what he was building with Charlotte, what it meant to be genuinely, irreversibly committed to another person when the life he ran required the kind of compartmentalization that commitment inevitably compromised. And Victoria had given him a door, and he had walked through it, and he had told himself for 5 years that the door had been real. He had always known, somewhere underneath the walls, that the door had been given to him. He just hadn't been ready to sit with it. He was sitting with it now, in the Westchester study, on a Friday morning, with the weight of 2 children's names pressing against his chest, like something structural had shifted in the building of him, and the fault line had finally given. Saturday, 9 o'clock, Jane Street. He was going to walk into that coffee shop and sit across from Charlotte Ashford, and he was going to begin the process of saying something for which there were no adequate words in any language he spoke. He did not know how she would receive it. He suspected she had been waiting for this conversation for 5 years, and that waiting had not made her more willing to have it. It had simply made her better prepared for it. He was not prepared. He had not been prepared for any of this since the moment he walked into a ballroom and found the woman he had discarded standing in the middle of it, running the room, looking like someone who had not needed him for a single day of the 5 years he had been gone. And somewhere in this city, in an apartment he had not been inside, In beds he had never seen, two 8-year-old boys were sleeping without a father's name on their birth records because the father had believed a lie that a calculated woman had handed him like a gift. Adrian DeLuca pressed his hands harder against the desk's surface until he could feel the edge of it cutting into his palms. Then he let go and stood up and went to do the rest of the day's work, because the work did not stop and the walls had to hold for one more day. He was at Birch on Jane Street at 8:47. The coffee shop was small and unhurried, the kind of place that had been on the same block for 15 years and intended to be there for 15 more. Wood surfaces, mismatched chairs, the smell of dark roast and something baked that morning, a chalkboard menu. 3 people at the counter and a woman in the corner working on a laptop who did not look up when he came in. Adrian ordered a black coffee and took a table near the window where he could see the door and sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup and waited. Charlotte arrived at 9 exactly. She came through the door in a dark green coat, cheeks slightly flushed from the cold, and scanned the room with the rapid professional efficiency of someone accustomed to walking into spaces and immediately assessing them. She found him in under 2 seconds. She came to the table and sat down without removing her coat and did not offer anything resembling a greeting. "You look like you haven't slept," she said. "I haven't." A waitress appeared. Charlotte ordered tea. The waitress left. Charlotte put her bag on the empty chair beside her and looked at Adrian with the same quality of attention she had directed at the stage malfunction at the gala. Precise, unhurried, already several steps ahead. "Say what you came to say," she said. He had rehearsed this. In the car, in the shower Friday morning, walking the length of the Westchester study at 2 in the morning, he had rehearsed the shape of how this conversation should go. He had arranged the information, sequenced the disclosures, planned the language. He was a man who prepared for difficult conversations the way he prepared for difficult negotiations, with structure, with contingency, with the discipline to control the pace. All of that dissolved the moment he sat across from her in the actual room. "I know about Logan and Landon," he said. Charlotte did not move, not a muscle. She held his gaze and her face did not change, and the only indication that the words had landed was a single slow breath that she took through her nose and released with absolute control. "What?" she said. "Do you know? Their birth date, the records, the timeline." He kept his voice low and level. "I had my people look into it. I needed to understand. You had your people look into my children." The word "my" landed like a door closing. "Charlotte, you sent investigators to look into my sons." She said it again, not a question, not an explosion, just the act of holding him to the exact shape of what he had done. "That's what you're telling me?" "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the tea the waitress had silently delivered and wrapped both hands around it and looked out the window at Jane Street, where a Saturday morning was assembling itself in the ordinary way of Saturday mornings. A man walking a dog, 2 women with strollers, a delivery truck blocking half the lane. "They're mine," she said to the window. "They have always been mine. That is the only truth in this that has ever mattered." "I know. Do you?" She looked back at him. "Because what I hear is a man who has spent 5 years not knowing, and now he knows, and now he's sitting across from me expecting—" "What exactly? What are you expecting from me right now?" "Nothing." He said it immediately. "I'm not expecting anything. I'm not here to make demands or claims or heart." "Then why are you here?" "Because I needed you to know that I know. And because—" He stopped, started again. "Because I found out something else. Something I have to tell you. And I don't know how to tell you except directly." Something shifted in her expression. Not alarm, something more guarded than alarm. The look of a woman who has learned that the category of things that can still hurt her is smaller than it used to be, but not empty. "Tell me," she said. He told her about Delacroix, about the shell company, the 14 months of surveillance, the report on the boy's parentage. He told her without softening any of it, because Charlotte Ashford had always responded to being handled with the same quiet fury she directed at incompetence, and she deserved the raw version. He told her that Victoria Kensington had known, with high confidence, that Logan and Landon were his sons, for over a year, that she had commissioned the investigation herself, that she had been sitting on that information while attending events in the same circles as Charlotte, while appearing at Adrian's elbow at a gala Charlotte was running, while making careful, precise observations about the boy's appearance. Charlotte listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, the coffee shop was the same coffee shop it had been. The woman with the laptop was still working. The Saturday morning outside was still assembling itself. None of the architecture of the ordinary world had shifted to acknowledge what had just been said at this table. "She knew," Charlotte said finally. "Yes. For 14 months she knew, and she said nothing to you." "Correct. And she said nothing to me." A pause. "But she was watching." "Yes." Charlotte set her tea down very carefully on the table in front of her. The care with which she did it, the deliberate, controlled placement of a cup on a surface, was the most frightening thing Adrian had seen in a room since the last time someone pointed a weapon at him. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to think before you answer." "All right. 5 years ago, the photographs, the report your people gave you." She looked at him directly. "Who gave you that information?" The question sat between them on the table like something with weight. He had known, from the moment Marcus laid the Delacroix file in front of him, that this question existed. He had known he would have to answer it. He had been moving toward this answer for 4 days, through the space of insufficient sleep and a persistent, low-grade nausea that had nothing to do with illness and everything to do with a truth that kept getting more complete as he approached it. "The initial report came from a contact in our intelligence network," he said. "A man named Gassel who ran background investigations. He brought the photographs to Petrov, and Petrov brought them to me." A pause. "I asked where Gassel got them. He said it came through a third party he'd worked with before, someone who flagged it to him as a matter of family interest." "A third party," Charlotte said. "I never pursued the source further. I should have." "You should have." She said it without particular emphasis. "Yes. I pursued the conclusion instead." "You pursued the conclusion," she repeated, "because the conclusion was, what, easier?" He didn't answer that because the honest answer was yes, and they both knew it, and saying it aloud served nothing except his own need to perform accountability. "Do you know who the third party was?" Charlotte asked. "I have a very strong suspicion. I don't have confirmation yet. My people are still—" "It was Victoria." He stopped. "I'm not asking," Charlotte said. "I'm telling you. It was Victoria Kensington who put those photographs in front of your people 5 years ago. And it was Victoria Kensington who had me investigated for the last 14 months. And it was Victoria Kensington who was standing next to you at my event 6 days ago, watching to see what you would do when you saw me." She picked up her tea again. "I'm not telling you this because it surprises me. I'm telling you because you need to say it out loud and confirm that you understand the complete shape of what happened." The coffee shop was very quiet around them. "She engineered it," Adrian said. "Yes. The photographs were fabricated, or real photographs of things that were not what they appeared to be. It doesn't actually matter which." Charlotte's voice was steady and precise. "What matters is that she identified exactly what would break your trust in me, built or found the evidence to support it, and delivered it through channels you considered reliable. And it worked." A pause. "It worked completely." He had nothing to say to that. "I knew," Charlotte said. "Not about Victoria specifically, not with evidence, but I knew the photographs were lies, and I knew that someone had put them there deliberately, and I knew that the person with the most to gain was the woman who had been in love with you for years while you were married to me. I knew all of that, and I told you, across our kitchen table, that you were making the worst mistake of your life." She looked at him. "And you left anyway?" "Yes. Because even knowing something wasn't right, you chose the evidence over me." The word "chose" landed the way she had clearly intended it to land. "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly. Not a gesture of acceptance, a gesture of confirmation, of someone who has been told the thing they already knew and is simply marking the moment of its being said aloud. "Then we understand each other," she said. She began to pull on her gloves. "I appreciate you telling me about Victoria and the investigation. I'll take steps to protect my business and my family from whatever she intends to do with what she knows. Charlotte, I want to help with that. My people can. I don't want your people near my children." The sentence was quiet and final. "I mean that without hostility. I mean it as a boundary that I am setting clearly, right now, so there is no confusion. Whatever Victoria Kensington is planning, I will handle it through my own means." She's dangerous when she's cornered. I've been raising two boys alone for 5 years while running a business from nothing. Charlotte looked at him with something that was not quite the absence of warmth, but was adjacent to it. I've been handling dangerous things without your assistance for a while now. She stood. He stood reflexively. I'm not angry, she said, looking at him from the other side of the table. I want you to understand that. I was angry for a very long time, and then I was tired, and then I was just building. What I feel right now, looking at you, is mostly exhaustion and something like pity, which I know you don't want. I don't want anything from you. That's the first thing you've said in this conversation that I completely believe. She picked up her bag. Don't come to the school again. She left. Adrian sat back down and looked at the half-empty coffee cup in front of him and felt the particular quality of silence that a room has after a person who is filling it has gone. He sat there for a while. Then he called Marcus. He spent the rest of Saturday making the Victoria problem concrete. Marcus had the additional Delacroix information by late afternoon, the full scope of what Victoria had commissioned, which was more extensive than the initial report had suggested. She had not simply investigated Charlotte. She had built a file. Photographs of the boys at school, at soccer games, at the aquarium on a field trip. Detailed timelines of Charlotte's movements. Financial analysis of Ashford events structured to identify vulnerabilities. And a specific document dated 11 months ago that appeared to be a draft of something, a letter or a statement never sent, that outlined with devastating specificity the claim that Logan and Landon DeLuca were being deliberately hidden from their father by their mother. The intended recipient of that draft was not Adrian. It was addressed to the New York Post. Adrian read the draft 3 times. The specific horror of it was not in the claim itself, but in the framing. Victoria had written it, or had it written, in the language of public interest journalism, positioning Charlotte as a woman who had systematically deprived her children of their father for financial and social gain. The draft was designed to be maximally damaging to Charlotte's professional reputation, to Ashford events, and to her standing as a parent. It was also designed to force Adrian's hand, to create a public situation that would require him to respond in ways that Victoria could control. It was 11 months old and had never been sent, which meant Victoria had been holding it, which meant she had been deciding when to use it. Where is she right now? Adrian asked Marcus. Her apartment on Park. She had dinner reservations at Oriole tonight, canceled this afternoon. She's been home since 3. He thought about going there. He ran the scenario to its conclusion in 3 seconds and recognized that going to Victoria's apartment right now, in his current state, would be the kind of decision that his worst self made and his better judgment spent years cleaning up. Watch her, he said. 24 hours. Nothing moves without me knowing. He drove back to Westchester and arrived at the empty house and went directly to his study and sat down and did not turn on the lights. The draft document sat in the file on his desk. He thought about Charlotte saying, I've been handling dangerous things without your assistance for a while now. He thought about the specific economy of how she had delivered that line, not bitterly, not with performance, simply as information, a statement of demonstrated fact. He thought about Logan and Landon. He had not allowed himself to think about them directly. He had circled them in his thinking for 6 days. The boys in the slightly askew suits, the quiet one's hand finding Charlotte's without being asked. The profile at the school fence with the jaw shaped exactly like his own father's jaw in a photograph he still had somewhere in this house. He had circled them because approaching them directly meant approaching the full weight of what he had not been there for, and he had not been ready for that weight. He let himself approach it now, in the dark study, alone. 8 years old. He had missed 8 years, not because he had not known. He had not known, that was factually true, but because the reason he had not known was a choice. He had chosen to believe a fabricated lie over his own wife's word, and that choice had a consequence that was 8 years old and had his father's jaw and did not know his name. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. His phone lit up on the desk. The text was from a number he didn't recognize, which in his world meant either a burner phone or someone who wanted him to know they had access to a channel he hadn't given them. The message was 6 words. We should talk. You know where. He stared at it. He did know where. Victoria had a place she used when she wanted conversations that didn't happen in her primary residence, a small, clean suite in a hotel on the Upper East Side that she maintained under a corporate name and had used over the years for the category of meetings that required discretion. He had been there twice, years ago, for reasons that now seemed to belong to a different version of himself. She was summoning him. He put the phone face down on the desk. He thought about the draft document. 11 months old, never sent. She had been holding it, which meant she was still making decisions about when and whether to use it. The cancellation of dinner reservations, the retreat to her apartment, the text from a burner number. She was recalibrating. She had been watching him since the gala, watching him seek out Charlotte, watching whatever signals reached her about his state of mind, and she was making a decision right now about how to play what she held. She held the draft document. She held the knowledge of the boy's parentage. She held, if she was as thorough as the evidence suggested, probably more that he hadn't found yet. His phone lit up again. Same number. One word this time. Tonight. He picked up the phone and looked at it. He had spent 6 days operating on the assumption that this was a situation he could manage with the tools he had always used. Information, patience, strategic positioning, the controlled application of pressure. He had been treating it like a family problem, which it was, but also like a business problem, which it was only adjacent to. The draft document changed the geometry. If Victoria sent that letter, if it reached the press, if it reached the wrong people, if it framed Charlotte as the architect of a deliberate deception, the damage would be immediate and severe and largely irreversible. Charlotte's reputation, her business, her standing in the communities that sustained Ashford events would take damage that no correction could fully undo, because the architecture of that kind of damage was built on the principle that the accusation outlives the retraction in the public memory. And beyond the professional damage, Logan and Landon, 8-year-old boys, the specific cruelty of what it would mean for two children to see their mother's name in the press in those terms, to go to school and face the version of that story that children construct from fragments they overhear. He stood up. He put on his jacket. He told himself he was going because he was a man who dealt with problems directly and had been in worse rooms than a hotel suite on the Upper East Side. He told himself he was going because he needed to know exactly what Victoria intended, and the only way to know that was to be in the room with her. Both of those things were true. The third thing, the thing underneath both of them, was that Charlotte's voice was still in his head. "I've been handling dangerous things without your assistance." And the unbearable implication of that sentence was that she had been doing it alone because he had made it necessary. And he could not sit in a dark study in Westchester while the woman who had engineered that necessity prepared to deliver one more blow to a person who had already absorbed more than any person should have to absorb alone. He walked out of the study. Sal was in the kitchen, eating something at the counter. He looked up when Adrian appeared in the doorway in his jacket. "Upper East Side," Adrian said. Sal put down his fork. "Just you," Adrian said. "No Marcus, no Dino, just the car." Sal studied him for exactly 1 second with the expression of a man who has spent enough years driving for Adrian DeLuca to recognize the specific quality of a decision that has already been made. "All right," Sal said, and stood up. In the car crossing the bridge into the city, Adrian's phone lit up one more time, not the burner number. Marcus. The text read, "Delacroix made contact with a journalist at the Post 40 minutes ago. Name is Brewer, covers society and crime crossover. Meeting was brief, location unknown. No content confirmed, but timing is not coincidental." Adrian read it twice. The draft document was no longer a threat being held in reserve. It was moving. The hotel on the Upper East Side was called the Hargrove, and it was the kind of place that existed specifically to accommodate the category of things that required no record. The lobby was small and deliberately understated. Dark wood paneling, a single desk staffed by a man who had perfected the expression of someone who saw nothing and remembered less. Adrian had been here twice before, years ago, when the world was configured differently and his relationship to Victoria Kensington had been something he had chosen, rather than something that had chosen him. Sal pulled to the curb, and Adrian was out of the car before it fully stopped. "Stay close," Adrian said, and went through the door. The man at the desk looked up and then looked at something on the surface in front of him and said, "Suite 412, without being asked, which confirmed that Victoria had arranged his arrival, which confirmed that she had been certain he would come, which told him something about how she had assessed his current state of mind. He took the stairs. 412 was at the end of a carpeted corridor that absorbed all sound. Footsteps, breath, the distant murmur of the city outside. Adrian reached the door and stood outside it for 3 seconds, not hesitating but organizing, the way you organize yourself before you walk into a room where the nature of the conversation will be determined in the first 30 seconds by whoever establishes the frame first. He knocked once and opened the door without waiting. Victoria was seated in an armchair near the window, a glass of white wine on the table beside her, dressed as though she had known this meeting would happen since before she sent the text. She probably had. She was wearing something dark and fitted, hair loose, the specific presentation of a woman who wants to appear relaxed, and has engineered the appearance with considerable effort. The suite was warm. A single lamp was lit. The window behind her showed the Upper East Side at night, the particular density of city light that made Manhattan look like something permanent. She looked at him when he came in, and her expression was the expression he had been watching for 12 years. Warm, calibrated, and completely armored behind both. "You came," she said. "You knew I would. I hoped." She gestured at the chair across from her. "Sit down, Adrian." "I'll stand." A slight shift in her expression. Not disappointment, adjustment. She picked up her wine glass and held it without drinking from it. "You've been busy this week." "Have I?" "You went to see her Saturday morning." A pause. "Jane Street." He said nothing. "And you've had people looking into Delacroix." She said the name without any particular inflection. "I assumed you would, eventually. You're thorough. It's one of the things I've always admired about you." "You should stop talking," he said, "and listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." Something moved in her eyes. Not fear. The recalibration of someone who has encountered a variable they had assigned a lower probability than it deserved. "Your people contacted a journalist at the Post tonight," Adrian said. "Brewer. Society and crime crossover. You're moving the document." The slightest pause. "I don't know what document you're—" "Victoria." His voice was flat and absolute. "Don't." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she set the wine glass down on the table with a precision that was its own kind of answer. "You found the draft." 11 months ago. Never sent. You've been deciding when." "I've been deciding a lot of things for a long time." The warmth had not entirely left her voice, but it had receded, pulling back to reveal something underneath that was harder and more honest. "That's what you do when you've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For you to see what was in front of you." She stood slowly and moved toward the window. Not toward him. Away from him, which he recognized as a tactical choice, creating space, managing the geometry of the room. "I have been in your life for 12 years, Adrian. 12 years. I was there when you built this family into what it is. I was there through every crisis, every loss, every moment when the people around you were scared and you needed someone who wasn't. And you spent that time building the mechanism to destroy my marriage. I spent that time watching you waste yourself on a woman who was never going to understand what you actually are." She turned from the window to face him, and the careful warmth was gone now, fully gone, and what was underneath it was something that had been compressed for a very long time. "Charlotte Ashford is a lovely event planner, Adrian. She's smart, and she's capable, and she built herself a nice life. Good for her. But she looked at you and she saw the version of you that you perform for people who can't handle the real one. I have always seen the real one. I have always been able to stand in the actual room with you. What you did," he said carefully, "is fabricate evidence. Bribe a man in my intelligence network. Feed me a lie through channels I trusted. And then you watched me sign divorce papers and walk out of my marriage and leave behind a pregnant woman, and you said nothing." The word pregnant landed in the room between them. Victoria's face went through something. Not guilt, not quite, but the specific expression of a person who has carried a piece of knowledge for so long that hearing it spoken aloud by someone else produces a physical response they cannot fully suppress. "You knew," Adrian said, "when I walked out of that house. You knew she was pregnant." "I suspected." "Don't." A pause. "Yes, I knew." The room was very quiet. Adrian had prepared for this answer. He had prepared for it intellectually, rationally, in the way you prepare for a thing you already know is true by naming it to yourself in advance so that the confirmation doesn't detonate you in front of the person who caused it. He had done that preparation, and it was completely inadequate. His hands were at his sides, and he pressed them flat against his thighs and breathed once, deliberately, through his nose. "You knew she was pregnant," he said, "and you let me leave. You made the choice to leave because you handed me a fabricated reason." His voice was still flat, still level, and he was aware that the flatness was costing him something in the vicinity of his chest that he was going to have to deal with later. "You built the exit, and you put me in front of it, and then when I walked through it, you knew there was a child on the other side of that door, and you said nothing, for 5 years. Victoria looked at him. The armor was still there, but it was showing stress fractures in places she couldn't control. A tension around her jaw, the particular stillness of someone who has decided that forward is the only direction available. "If I had told you," she said, "you would have gone back." "Yes." "To her. To a marriage that was already, to my child." The word came out with an edge that cut through the flatness. "To my children. There were 2 of them, Victoria. 2. And I didn't know because you made certain I wouldn't. I didn't know it was twins until you had them investigated." He took one step toward her, just one. 14 months ago, when your people pulled their school records and their birth documents and built a parentage report that told you, in clinical language, what you had been responsible for since the day you put those photographs in front of my people. Another step. And your response to learning the full scope of what you had done was to draft a letter to a newspaper designed to destroy the woman who had been raising my sons alone for 8 years. Mas. Victoria did not step back. She held her ground, which he registered as the last performance of a woman who understood that stepping back in this room, in this moment, was a concession she couldn't recover from. "The letter was never sent," she said. "It is being sent tonight. Your people contacted Brewer 2 hours ago." "I can stop that." "You'll stop it right now." He held out his hand. "Phone." Something crossed her face, a flash of something that might, in another context, have been genuine, and then she picked up her phone from the table beside the armchair and held it out to him. He took it. He scrolled to her most recent call log. He found a number that matched the contact name Delacroix, and he called it. And when a man answered on the second ring, Adrian said, "This is Adrian DeLuca. Whatever action you currently have in progress for Kensington is terminated as of this call. You will confirm that to me in the next 10 seconds, or I will take an interest in your organization that you will find significantly more disruptive than losing one client." A pause, then, "Understood. Confirmed." He ended the call. He set Victoria's phone on the table between them. "Adrian, I'm not finished." He looked at her directly, and when he spoke again, the flatness was gone, and what replaced it was not a shout, but something in some ways worse than a shout. A voice stripped to its essential register, with no performance left in it at all. "You took 8 years from my sons. You took 8 years from a woman who had done nothing except trust me. And when I let her down, she absorbed the entire consequence of that alone, because you made certain she would have to. Everything she built, the company, the life, the 18 hours a day she put into raising 2 children by herself, she built in the space you created when you engineered the destruction of her marriage." He paused. "There is no version of any conversation between us after tonight. There is no context in which we speak, meet, or communicate. If you contact Charlotte or her business or anyone connected to her sons, I will know within 24 hours, and the response will not be a phone call." Victoria Kensington looked at him. She had known him for 12 years. She knew the difference between the performance of a threat and the architecture of one. She had built her entire strategy on an accurate reading of who he was and how he functioned. She read him now. "I understand," she said. He picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd dropped it and walked to the door. "Adrian?" Her voice stopped him. Not the warmth this time. Something he had never heard from her before. Stripped of calibration, genuinely unguarded. "I did love you. Whatever else is true. I want you to know that." He stood with his hand on the door and looked at the wood grain of it. "What you loved," he said, "was the version of me that didn't have a family. You engineered the removal of that family so the version you wanted could exist." He opened the door. "That's not love. That's inventory management." He went out into the corridor. The door closed behind him and the carpeted hallway absorbed the sound of it completely. He walked to the stairwell and went down and through the lobby and out onto the sidewalk, where the city night hit him with cold air and noise and the smell of exhaust and, somewhere upwind, food from a cart on the corner. Sal was at the curb with the engine running. Adrian stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the cold do what the cold did, clarified things, reduced them to their essential temperature. He got in the car. "Westchester?" Sal asked. "No." He looked at his phone. 3 missed calls from Marcus, a text that read, "Brewer has gone dark. Not answering Delacroix, follow-up. May have pulled back." And below that, a second text from a number he recognized as the caretaker Charlotte used when she needed overnight coverage. "Mrs. Ashford asked me to let you know. She needs to speak with you. Tomorrow, 11. The Hudson River path near Pier 84. She said you'd understand." He read it twice. "West side," he said to Sal. "Pier 84 area. I need to walk the path first." Sal pulled into traffic without asking why. He needed to see the location before the conversation. That was how he operated. You never walked into a space cold if you had the option of knowing it first. But underneath the operational logic was something simpler. He needed to move. He needed to be in motion, because sitting still right now meant sitting with the full accumulated weight of the evening, and he was not yet ready to sit with that. Charlotte had reached out. She had initiated contact, which she had not done once in 5 years, which meant something had changed on her end. Something had shifted. Some threshold had been crossed. He didn't know if it was the information he had given her Saturday morning, or something she had learned subsequently, or simply a decision that had been approaching for days and had arrived. He didn't know what she intended to say. He knew what he intended to say. He had known since Friday morning, reading the Delacroix file in the Westchester study with his hands flat on the desk. He had known the shape of it even if he hadn't found the language. The language was still inadequate. He understood that. There was no formulation of words that covered the specific geography of what had been done and left undone. But language was what they had, and tomorrow at 11 on the Hudson River path, he was going to use the best version of it he could construct. Sal parked near the entrance to the path, and Adrian walked. The Hudson at night was wide and dark and indifferent, which was what rivers were. They didn't register the things that happened on their banks. They just continued. The lights of New Jersey were reflected in the water in long, broken columns, and the path was mostly empty at this hour. A few joggers, a couple walking with their hands in each other's coat pockets, cold coming off the water and a steady, flat pressure against his face. He walked to a point on the path where a bench looked directly west across the river and stopped. He stood there and thought about Logan and Landon. He allowed himself to do it directly this time, without the circling, without the protective distance. 2 boys, 8 years old, who had grown up in the specific shape of absence that fathers leave when they are not present. Not the dramatic, obvious shape, but the quiet architectural shape. The shape you find in the negative space of ordinary things. Who teaches you to tie a particular knot. Whose voice you hear in your head when you're deciding whether to be brave. Whose absence you don't fully name because you've never known the presence. He had a father. Not a good one, by most measures, but a present one. And even the damaged, compromised version of presence had given him something to push against, which was its own form of foundation. His sons had been pushing against nothing. They had been building themselves from the material their mother provided, which, given the material Charlotte Ashford was made of, was considerable. They were well-adjusted and performing above grade level and well-liked and had his father's jaw. They had built themselves without him, and they had built themselves well. That did not reduce the weight of the absence. It made it, in some ways, more specific and therefore more devastating. The knowledge that they had been fine without him, that his presence was not a rescue but an addition, an arrival after the structure was already standing. He was not coming to save anything. He was coming to ask permission to stand near something he had no right to claim. He stood at the river for a long time. His phone vibrated. Marcus. Victoria's apartment. Lights out, no outgoing calls for the last 90 minutes. She's standing down for now. He put the phone away. For now was not the same as permanently, and he knew that. And he would deal with the not permanent reality of Victoria Kensington in the days and weeks ahead with the tools available to him. But tonight she was standing down, and the document had not reached Brewer, and Charlotte was alive and unbothered in whatever part of the West Village she had built her life in. Tonight, that was enough. He turned and walked back along the path toward the car. Tomorrow. 11 o'clock. He had never, in 12 years of running a family that operated in the most brutal margin of American life, been genuinely afraid of a conversation. He had walked into rooms with men who wanted him dead and conducted those conversations with the particular calm of someone who understood that fear was a resource to be managed, not a response to be experienced. Standing on the Hudson River path at 11:30 on a Saturday night, he was afraid of the conversation he was going to have in less than 12 hours. Not of Charlotte's anger. He had seen the quality of her anger on Saturday morning, and it was not the explosive kind. It was the slow geological kind, the kind that had already done its work and left behind a landscape rearranged. He was not afraid of being hurt. He was afraid of something more specific, of being seen completely, of standing in front of a woman who had already absorbed the truth about him and outlasted it, and asking, with nothing in his hands, for something that could not be negotiated or purchased or secured through the application of any resource he currently possessed. He was going to ask for the chance to be a father. And the answer to that question did not belong to him. It belonged entirely to Charlotte and to two boys who did not know his name, and to the 8 years of mornings and ordinary moments and the specific weight of a family assembled without him. And all of that was waiting on a riverside path tomorrow morning, with a clarity and a judgment that no amount of power or wealth or the feared reputation of the DeLuca name could touch. Sal saw him coming and had the door open before he reached the car. Adrian got in. He sat with the city moving past the windows all the way back to Westchester, and he did not sleep when he got home. And at some point in the small hours, he stopped trying. He was sitting at the desk in his study when the morning came, with the Hudson River path already mapped in his head and the inadequate language still assembling itself, and the first pale light coming through the windows of a house that had been empty for 5 years, and the knowledge that in a few hours he was going to walk toward the hardest thing he had ever done without a single weapon in his hands. He arrived at Pier 84 at 10:43. The Hudson River path on a Sunday morning in late autumn had a specific quality of emptiness that was different from the emptiness of other places and other times. It was not abandoned. It was cleared, the way a stage is cleared before something that requires the full use of the space. The river was steel gray and moving with a slow, authoritative weight, carrying itself toward the harbor, the way it had been carrying itself for longer than the city on its banks had existed. The air coming off the water was cold and direct and smelled of iron and distance. Adrian stood at the railing above the water with his hands in his coat pockets and watched a barge move south at the pace of something that had no deadline. He heard her footsteps on the path behind him at 10:58. He turned. Charlotte was walking alone. No caretaker, no boys, no buffer of any kind. Just herself in a dark coat with her hands in her pockets and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She walked with the particular directness that he had been watching all week. The quality of a person who has decided something and is walking toward the execution of that decision without wasting motion on anything else. She stopped beside him at the railing. She looked at the river for a moment before she spoke. "Victoria contacted me," she said, "last night, around midnight." He went still. "She called my personal number, which I have no idea how she had, and she spoke for approximately 4 minutes. Charlotte kept her eyes on the water. "She told me everything. The photographs 5 years ago, how she built the evidence, the man in your network that she paid, the draft letter she never sent." A pause. "She said she was calling to, and I'm using her exact word, confess." Adrian said nothing. "She cried," Charlotte said. "I don't know if it was real. I don't know if it matters." She turned to look at him. "I'm telling you this because you should know she called, and because what she told me confirmed everything you told me on Saturday, and some things you didn't know yet." "What things?" "She knew I was pregnant before you left. She said she found out through your household, one of the staff who talked. She made a specific decision not to tell you. She said last night that she had been trying to tell herself for 5 years that the pregnancy was something she hadn't factored into it, that she'd simply acted, and the consequence was something she found out afterward." Charlotte paused. She said she was lying to herself. The barge on the river had moved further south. A jogger passed behind them on the path, and the sound of her footsteps faded. "I didn't call you here because of Victoria," Charlotte said. "I called you here because of Logan and Landon, and because I've been awake for most of the last 3 days trying to figure out how to do this correctly. And I've come to the conclusion that there is no correct way. There's only the honest way, so that's what I'm going to do." All right. She turned to face the river again. When I found out I was pregnant, I considered telling you. I want you to know that. I'm not going to rewrite that part of the history to make myself more sympathetic. I considered it seriously for about 3 weeks, and then I decided not to. She paused. I told myself it was because you had made your choice, and the boys deserved a life free from the complication of a father who had chosen to believe the worst about their mother. That was the reason I told myself. Fine. Was it true? Partly. She was quiet for a moment. The other part was that I was 29 years old and alone and terrified, and I couldn't face the possibility that you'd come back only because of the children and not because of anything you actually understood or felt. I couldn't face building something with you on the foundation of obligation. She said the word like it had a taste she'd been carrying for years, said the word like, I would rather do it alone on a foundation I controlled than do it together on a foundation I didn't trust. He stood with that for a moment. I'm not telling you that to make you feel worse, she said. I'm telling you because you deserve the complete picture, not just the part where you're the one who was wrong. You were protecting your sons. I was protecting myself, she said. The boys were fine either way. Children are resilient when they have what they need, and I made sure they had what they needed. I was the one who couldn't face it. A pause. I've spent a lot of time the last 3 days being honest with myself about the difference. The wind came off the river in a long, flat push that moved Charlotte's hair, and she reached up and held it back with one hand, and the gesture was so ordinary and unguarded that it hit him somewhere below his prepared language and his planned approach, and all the infrastructure of the conversation he had rehearsed. Charlotte. His voice came out differently than he intended. Not the controlled register of the last week's conversations, not the careful, flat voice he used when he was managing himself. Something underneath that. I have to say this, and I'm going to say it badly, and I'm asking you to hear it anyway. She looked at him. What I did 5 years ago was not a mistake, he said. A mistake is a miscalculation, an accident, something that happens at the edge of your attention. What I did was a choice. I chose to believe something because believing it was easier than what the alternative required. The alternative required me to stand completely inside my marriage without an exit available, and I wasn't ready to do that. I was afraid of it, and Victoria handed me a way out, and I used it. He paused. I'm not going to ask you to forgive that. I'm not going to ask you for anything that I haven't earned. I just need you to know that I understand. Not what I lost, but what I chose to leave. Those are different things, and the difference matters to me. Charlotte looked at him for a long time. Then she looked back at the river. I know the difference, she said quietly. I've known it for 5 years. The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has weight and texture, the kind that accumulates between two people who have been carrying the same thing from opposite ends for a very long time and have finally set it down in the same place. The boys, she said. This is what I need to tell you and why I'm here. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. Logan knows something is happening. He's 8, but he's been watching me this week. He watches me the way kids do when they sense that the adults in their life are dealing with something large. He asked me last night if everything was okay. She paused. Landon hasn't asked anything. He never asks. He just sat closer to me than usual at dinner, which is his version of the same question. Adrian's chest was doing something he could not regulate. They have never had a father, Charlotte said. Not as a present reality. Logan went through a period when he was 6 where he asked about it, and we had an honest conversation that was calibrated for a 6-year-old, which means it was honest but incomplete. He accepted it and moved on the way children move on when the environment around them is stable enough to allow it. She turned to look at him. Landon has never asked, not once, which is either because he has found a way to be completely at peace with it, or because it lives somewhere inside him that he doesn't have the language for yet. I don't know which. I probably won't know for years. I don't know how to do this, Adrian said. I want you to know that I am aware of that. I know what I am and what I've built, and what the life I run looks like from the outside and from the inside, and I'm not standing here pretending that any of that is a simple thing to bring near children, near your children. He stopped. Near my sons. The phrase "my son's in his own mouth" felt both entirely accurate and completely presumptuous, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and he let them be. "No," Charlotte said. "It's not simple. And I'm not going to pretend to you that I've arrived here at some peaceful resolution where all of that stops mattering. It matters enormously. Who you are, what you do, the world you operate in, it matters. And any arrangement we build around the boys has to be built with eyes open to all of it, not with the version of it that makes the conversation easier." "Agreed. I need your word," she said, "that what I'm about to agree to is for them, not for you. Not to resolve your guilt or satisfy your grief over what you missed. For Logan and Landon, because they are the ones who will live inside whatever we build, and they are the ones who will pay the price if we build it wrong." "You have it. Your word doesn't mean to me what it once meant," she said, not cruelly. "Precisely. I know that. You know that. So what I'm asking you to understand is that this will be built on demonstrated behavior over time, not on a promise made on a river path. If you show up and then stop showing up, I will end it, and the boys will grieve that loss, and I will hold you accountable for that grief in whatever way is available to me." "I understand. If the nature of your life brings danger to them or to me, I will end it immediately and without negotiation." "Yes. And if at any point Logan or Landon tells me that they don't want this, that they're not comfortable, that it's not working for them, their word is final. They are not obligated to build a relationship with you because biology says they should." "I would not want them to," he said. "I would want them to because they chose to." She looked at him for a long moment after he said that. Something moved in her expression that she didn't fully control, something tired and cautious, and underneath both of those things, faintly, the residue of the woman who had once sat across a dinner table from him and laughed at something he said and meant it completely. It was gone quickly, but it had been there. "I'm going to tell them today," she said. "I'm going to tell them that their father has found his way back, and that he wants to be part of their lives if they'll allow it, and that it is completely their choice." She paused. "I'm not going to tell them the full story of why he was absent. That story is too large for 8-year-olds, and it belongs to them as they grow into the age where they can hold it. For now, they need the simple truth. He is here, he wants to know them, and whether they want to know him is up to them." "That's fair." "It's not about fair." She said it evenly. "It's about what they need." He nodded. She turned back to the river one more time, and they stood there together for a while without speaking, which was different from the weighted silences of their earlier conversations. Less like confrontation, more like two people sharing the same cold air and the same gray river and the same long, complicated history that had brought them to this specific railing on this specific Sunday morning. "I'm not going to come back to you," she said finally. Her voice was quiet and without drama. "I want to be clear about that. What we had, the marriage, the life we were building, I grieved that for a very long time, and the grief is finished. What I feel when I look at you is not residual love waiting to be reignited. It's history, a lot of shared history and a lot of damage, and somewhere inside all of that, 2 children who deserved better from both of us." Please, she paused. "I forgive you. I'm saying that clearly so you can hear it and carry it. Not because you've earned it yet, you haven't, but because forgiveness isn't something I'm withholding until you've done sufficient penance. It's something I'm choosing because carrying unforgiveness is a weight I stopped being willing to carry." She looked at him. "But forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation. The woman who loved you is not coming back. She built someone else in the years you were gone, and that person is who I am now, and that person is not yours." Adrian heard every word of that. He heard it the way you hear something that is entirely true and exactly what you needed someone to say out loud, not because it gave you what you wanted, but because it gave you what the situation actually required, which was the complete and honest shape of it. "I know," he said, and he did. They left the river path separately. Charlotte walked back north toward the parking area, and Adrian stood at the railing for a few minutes after she'd gone, watching the Hudson continue its indifferent progress toward the harbor, and he thought about a word she had used. Chose. She had chosen forgiveness, not because he had earned it, because she had decided that the carrying of it was over. He thought about what choosing looked like when it had no strategic component, No advantage attached, no outcome it was purchasing. When it was simply the decision of a person who had gotten tired of the alternative. He had spent 12 years in a world where every choice was attached to an outcome, where the decision and the return on the decision were always in some relationship to each other. It had made him very effective, and it had made him, in certain essential ways, very poor. He turned and walked back toward the car. Sal was where he always was, engine running, patient as geography. In the car, Adrian did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I need to find a soccer game." Sal looked at him in the mirror. "Logan plays in a youth league," Adrian said. "I need to find out when the next game is." Sal nodded and said nothing else, which was exactly right. 3 days later, Charlotte texted him an address and a time. A park in the West Village, Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. A youth soccer match. She added, below the address, a single sentence. "They know you're coming." Logan said, "Okay." Landon didn't say anything, but he asked what you looked like. He read that last sentence 4 times. Landon didn't say anything, but he asked what you looked like. He put the phone down and pressed his hand flat on the desk and breathed. Saturday came. He wore nothing that announced him. Dark jeans, a gray jacket, boots. He left the car 2 blocks from the park and walked. The morning was cold and bright, the sky completely clear, and the park was full of the particular noise of youth sports, the compressed, enthusiastic chaos of small humans running toward and away from a ball, while adults on the sideline performed their supportive attention. Folding chairs and travel mugs and the specific parental vigilance that looks casual but isn't. Charlotte was standing near the halfway line with her arms crossed against the cold, watching the field. She saw him coming and gave him a nod that acknowledged his arrival without making it significant, which was the right calibration, and told him she had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, with precision and without sentimentality. He came to stand beside her, leaving space between them, and looked at the field. He found Logan first. Easier to find, more movement, the social one. Already identifiable by the way he occupied the space around him with an easy physical confidence. He was playing forward, and he was fast, and he had a laugh that carried across the field when a teammate did something unexpected. Adrian watched him for a while with something in his chest that had no name in any language he'd been taught. Then he found Landon. Landon was playing midfield, and he was doing it the way he apparently did everything, with a quiet, architectural attentiveness that made him look, from the sideline, like the player who was always exactly where the ball was about to be rather than where it currently was. He didn't shout. He didn't celebrate when his team scored. He simply moved to the next position. He was the one who saw Adrian first. From across the field, mid-play, Landon turned his head. Not toward the ball, not toward the sideline in general, but directly at Adrian, with the same unerring accuracy he had shown at the gala doorway weeks ago. The same quality of attention, the same stillness. He looked for a long moment. Then he turned back to the game. Adrian breathed. At halftime, Charlotte put her hand briefly on his arm. Just a touch, informational, a signal. And then walked toward the field where both boys were coming off. She spoke to them for a moment, something short and quiet, and then she brought them over. Logan arrived at speed the way he apparently arrived everywhere. He stopped in front of Adrian and looked up with an expression that was openly, unabashedly evaluating. Curious and direct in the way of a child who has not yet learned to make that assessment less visible. "You're Adrian," he said. "Yes." "Mom said you're—" He paused, working something out. "Our dad." "Yes." Logan considered this for approximately 3 seconds with the focused efficiency of someone who has a game to return to. "Did you play soccer?" "When I was young, not very well." "I'm better than average for my age," Logan said with no particular modesty, and turned and ran back toward his teammates. Adrian looked down. Landon was standing 2 feet away, hands at his sides, looking up at him with those eyes that had his father's eyes' shape and his mother's particular quality of assessment combined into something that was entirely its own person. He didn't say anything. Adrian crouched down so they were at the same level. "I know you don't know me," Adrian said. "I want you to know that I'm aware of that. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Landon looked at him. "I missed a lot," Adrian said. "That's my fault, not yours. I'm not going to explain it all right now because it's a lot, and you've got a second half to play." But I want you to know that I'm here because I want to be here, not because anyone made me." Landon was quiet for another moment. Then he said, in a voice that was low and careful, "Are you going to leave again?" The question landed in Adrian's sternum like something structural. He held the boy's gaze. "No," he said. "I'm not going to leave." Landon looked at him for a long, assessing moment with those old soul eyes, and whatever he was measuring, he measured it in silence and at his own pace, and Adrian did not rush it. He held still and let himself be looked at completely, which was the most exposed he had been in 12 years in a world built on the management of exposure. Then Landon nodded. One nod. Small, definitive, the gesture of someone who has made a provisional but genuine decision. He turned and walked back toward the field. Adrian stayed crouched for a moment after the boy left, looking at the grass in front of him. Then he stood. Charlotte was beside him again, a few feet away, her arms still crossed, watching the boys return to their positions on the field. "He'll test you," she said, "consistently, for a long time. He doesn't trust quickly." "I know." "Logan will be easier. He moves fast and forgives fast and decides fast. Landon will watch everything you do, and he'll remember all of it." She paused. "He asked what you looked like. What he was actually asking was what kind of person you were. He uses looks as a proxy for character because he's 8, and it's the tool he has." "What did you tell him?" "I told him he'd have to find out for himself." She glanced at him sideways briefly. "That's still true." The second half started. Adrian stood on the sideline next to the mother of his sons and watched his boys play soccer on a cold, bright Saturday morning in the West Village, and said nothing and felt the slow and monumental weight of ordinary things. Logan scored in the 32nd minute and celebrated by running the length of the sideline with his arms out like wings, and when he passed Adrian, he gave him a look that was pure, uncomplicated delight, the look of a child who is not yet complicated about who gets to witness his happiness. Landon, in the 41st minute, made a pass so precisely placed that it stopped two parents near Adrian mid-conversation to watch, and then immediately repositioned without acknowledging that he'd done anything notable. Adrian watched both of them and said nothing, and felt something happening inside him that was not the resolution of grief, and not the satisfaction of a problem solved, and not the relief of a debt beginning to be repaid. It was something simpler and more difficult than any of those things. It was the specific sensation of beginning, which is always harder than it looks from the outside, because beginning requires you to admit that everything before it was something else. And that admission has a weight that does not distribute evenly across the moment it arrives. He had run a family of a different kind for 12 years. He had made decisions in rooms where the consequences were immediate and final, and written in terms he understood. He had built walls and maintained them, and lived inside the architecture of a life that was powerful and complete and utterly insufficient in every way that was currently standing in front of him on a soccer field. That life was not over. He was not a man who could simply unmake what he had built, but it was no longer the only life he was running, and he understood, watching Landon find his position for a corner kick with the precise, unhurried attention of someone who already knew where the ball was going to be, that the other life, the one he was just beginning to inhabit, was going to require everything the first one had required and then something additional that had no name yet. The game ended. Charlotte's team won. Logan was voluble about it. Landon was not. They walked together toward the park's exit. Charlotte, the two boys, and Adrian at a slight remove, finding the appropriate distance for a first day. Logan filled the space between them with commentary on the game and questions about lunch and information about a field trip at school on Tuesday. Landon walked close to Charlotte with his hand occasionally brushing hers, not taking it, just touching it in that specific way that meant he was monitoring her presence. At the park exit, Charlotte stopped and looked at Adrian. "Next Saturday," she said. "Logan has a drama rehearsal at 2. You can pick him up after and take them both for an hour. There's a good place for hot chocolate on Bleecker." She said it the way she organized events, practically, without sentiment, the right information delivered in the right order. "After that, we'll see." "After that, we'll see," he said. She nodded. She put her hands back on the boys' shoulders and steered them toward the car, and Logan called back something about hot chocolate with the enthusiasm of someone who had already decided this was a good development, and Landon turned once and looked at Adrian from the sidewalk with those level, measuring eyes. Adrian raised a hand, a small gesture, not a wave exactly, an acknowledgement. Landon looked at it for a moment. Then he turned and followed his mother. Adrian stood at the park exit and watched them go. The three of them moving down the West Village sidewalk in the specific formation that a family makes when it has spent years as a unit. The instinctive calibration of bodies that know each other's rhythms. The ease of proximity that accumulates from thousands of ordinary days. He was not part of that formation yet. He might, in time, become something adjacent to it. Something that orbited it with enough consistency and enough patience to eventually be taken into account by its geometry. Not as its center, but as one of its reliable points. A presence that was counted on, that showed up, that could be trusted to still be there when the assessing eyes of a quiet 8-year-old turned to check. He watched them until they turned the corner and were gone. Then he put his hands in his coat pockets and walked back toward the car through the cold, bright morning. And the Hudson was 2 blocks west, and he could feel it the way you feel a large body of water, even when you can't see it. In the quality of the air, in the particular direction of the wind. Still moving, still carrying itself toward the harbor with the patience of something that has been doing this longer than anything watching it. He had a meeting Monday morning. He had obligations he had deferred, and people waiting on decisions, and a business that did not pause for the private upheaval of its principal. He would attend to all of it, as he always had, with the discipline of a man who understood that the work did not stop. But between now and Monday, he had the rest of Saturday, and he intended to do something he had not done in a very long time. He intended to do absolutely nothing, to sit somewhere without an agenda, without an objective, without the management of any outcome except the slow, difficult, irreplaceable work of learning to carry the full weight of who he was and what he had done and what he was going to spend the rest of his life trying, without guarantee, to build from the ruins of it. Not because someone had forgiven him, not because the debt was paid or the path was clear or the outcome was assured, but because a quiet boy with old soul eyes had looked at him from a sidewalk and turned away without running, which was, in the specific language of 8-year-olds who do not trust quickly and remember everything, the most generous thing anyone had offered him in years. Sal had the car at the curb. Adrian got in. "Where to?" Sal asked. Adrian looked out the window at the West Village street, at the ordinary Saturday morning assembling itself around the absence of 2 boys who had walked around a corner and taken something with them that he hadn't known he was carrying until the moment it shifted. "Nowhere," he said. "Just drive." Sal pulled into traffic. The city moved past the windows, enormous and indifferent and full of ordinary things happening to ordinary people with the quiet, relentless persistence of lives being lived. Adrian DeLuca sat in the back of the car and let it carry him through it, and for the first time in 12 years, he had no destination in mind, and found that he could bear that, and that bearing it was, in its own way, enough.